Hey there, comrades. Welcome to this week's episode of Red Library, political education podcast for today's left. We're coming at you this week with part 2 of Bell Hooks's The Will to Change, Men, Masculinity, and Love, with myself and our most excellent comrade patrons Tiberius and Ryan. We hope you enjoyed part 1 last week, and part 2 is going to be rounding out the second half of the book, talking about things like masculinity in the media, spirituality, shame, forgiveness, and wrapping up with some of our closing thoughts and critiques and ideas on what the left can take from this book right now today. We're going to get right into the episode, but let's run down our ways to support Red Library if you would like to do so. First and foremost, if you would like to become a patron for as little as $1 a month, and that's roughly a quarter per episode, head on over to our Patreon page. You can find a link in the show notes, and support us materially, emotionally, spiritually, ideologically, all that good stuff. You'll get access to our Discord server with our book groups, roundtable discussions, lots of shit posting, good memes, lots of the discourse. Mwah! Remember to follow us on Twitter, like the show on Facebook, and if you're listening on iTunes, please go down and give us one of those starred reviews. Maybe write us a line or two, as that helps get our show into more potential comrade patrons' feeds, spreads the message around all across the globe. Last but not least, remember that Red Library is part of the Lost Horizons podcasting network, along with our podrads at The Regrettable Century and From 78. Remember, we come out with a roundtable discussion podcast, including your comrades from all 3 shows, talking about dialectical pessimism, organizing, psychoanalysis, all that other good stuff. And you can find that in the show links as well. All right, here we go. Bell Hooks Part 2 coming at you. We'll see you back here afterward.
Yeah, we left off with, I think we're on chapter 6. We got through chapter 5, I think, right? That was about male sexual being. So yeah, we talked about what it's like to be a sexual male under patriarchy. And now we're on this chapter about work. I'll just read my summary. So this chapter is called Work. What's love got to do with it? ? For Hooks, men's relationship with work is unhealthy because it is all consuming. Men dedicate so much investment in terms of their time, their emotions, not as well as their masculine identity, that they have little energy left for building healthy relations of love outside of work. This leaves them ill-equipped to help with domestic work, to get to know themselves through having meaningful alone time, and ill-equipped to build healthy relationships in general. When the patriarchal promises of power are not met through men's relationship to work, they turn to unhealthy coping habits such as sex and drug addiction, or violence, rage, and withdrawal. So Bell Hooks argues that work can and should be made more meaningful for men, and that it can be structured in a way that fosters men's emotional well-being. And she talks about trying to make work like more compatible with like a feminist masculinity. Before we get into the questions, see if you have any thoughts right off the bat about just like that notion.
I think for me, this was one of the weaker chapters. In particular, I think the reason why is that she's just sort of working off of the, I think, correct assumption that the structure of work is an inherently patriarchal structure, that capitalism has basically taken this pre-capitalist, feudalist, patriarchal structure and just basically mapped that into the systems of power that capitalism created in the workplace, right? And so I think the focus on, well, we need to have workplaces reflect a better masculinity. It's kind of one of those sort of reformist reforms of the system. It's a really like weak critique or a weak solution to what could be a much better critique of like the dynamics involved here, because this is true not just of men. This is true of basically the entire working force. Everybody who is working in a typical office or factory or wherever it is that you're working in situations that are like this, that are inherently like physically, emotionally, and psychically draining and damaging. So it's like, I see the critique, I get what you're doing, but that's not really going to change. It's kind of just inherent into the capitalist system. It's like, it's just the way in which the system is structured. You're not going to meaningfully reform that out of existence.
I was thinking about Hooks's like hyphenated chain of signifiers we were talking about of patriarchy, capitalism, imperialism, white supremacy. And I do wonder if the reason why this particular chapter might be more weak is precisely because even though she's wanting to operate with all of those functioning or having a similar weight, that privileging the sort of patriarchal critique here without privileging the capitalist critique, or sort of, just kind of utilizing them in a different way, I think does, just reading the summary, make me think like, well, how exactly is this going to solve the problem of the way that capitalism structures the division of labor and all of this other stuff that you're talking about, Tiberius? I mean, the other thing too is like, I'm a little wary of how easily this could be co-opted by a liberal sort of reformist reform, precisely because of this sentence that when the patriarchal promises of power are not met through men's relationship to work, they turn to unhealthy coping habits such as sex and drug addiction or violence, rage, and withdrawal. So part of me is like, well, if you only look at this or primarily look at this with a feminist critique, it's sort of implied that you can reform the workplace to somehow make it more psychologically healthy for men without necessarily understanding like what are the real causes of those sorts of things. I mean, I think that like social environmental factors on depression and anxiety, I mean, the most recent studies I've seen is that you can probably attribute anywhere between like 70 to 80% of most people's like diagnosable experiences of like depression and anxiety as actually being related to things like work and like lack of community and all this other stuff. But I don't know how you critique that or how you go far enough with that unless you privilege a sort of anti-capitalist like sort of critique of the way that capitalism structures the economic way that production happens as a whole.
So I do want to say that I agree what both of you are saying, but I also think that we can take so one of the questions I ask is like, how does bell hooks understand the relationship between capitalism and patriarchy? And I think Adam basically laid it out pretty well, that she privileges patriarchy, at least in this book, even if that's not her intention. I think she basically privileges it analytically, and thus I also think she just makes it more foundational than it actually is in terms of how it actually operates within our class society. But I think that what we can do is actually I think she does make some really valid critiques of the relationship between patriarchy and work and male identity. And I think what we can do is take her critiques further than she is able to, because I think of her limited framework. So I'm curious what you all think about that, because, well, I just want to read a couple of quotes. So there's this quote down on page 101. This is sort of the beginning of what I find really useful. Well, actually, first, just on page 97 real quick. She says that when men gather at work, they rarely have meaningful conversations. They jeer, they grandstand, they joke, but they don't share feeling. They relate in a scripted and limited way, careful to remain within the emotional boundaries set by patriarchal thinking about masculinity. I just want to highlight that quote real quick because, well, for one, it's interesting to think about it in relation to work and how like work is tied up with our fear of, making sure that we get enough to eat and survive and stuff. But it's also, I thought it was a really good quote. Because I was like, yeah, I personally have experienced that all the time. Like if you've ever had like a interaction with like another guy at work, it's like, that's exactly how they usually are. We just talk about bullshit, but we never actually delve into how we're actually feeling about anything, which I think actually has an effect that makes it could potentially make it harder to organize your workplace sometimes if you're unwilling to talk about how your work makes you feel. So later on page 101, she says that in actuality, individual men are engaged in the work of emotional recovery every day, but the work is not easy because they have no support systems within patriarchal culture, especially if they are poor and working class. And I, just want to give big snaps to that quote. I do think that's very true. And so a question I have is like, what would those support systems look like? And she talks about the success of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I will say, I don't know, I can't really speak to the success of AA because I've never participated in it. I do know that, I know people who have participated in it. I know family members who participated in it, and like they are much better off now. But she says that the success of AA is tied to the fact that the practice of recovery takes place in the context of community, and that people's shame about their failure can be expressed and male longing can be healing and validated. Finally, we're getting to the part where I want to highlight of like what I think is potentially useful about her critique and her proposed solutions. So she says on page 104, talking about like what it could be like to transform work to basically be more holistic with the rest of male identity, is to imagine if counseling was available to all men to help them find well, the work that they can do with joy. Imagine work settings that offer timeouts where workers can take classes in relational recovery. And so the thing about it is, I don't think any of that is really, well, for one, it's definitely not possible without class struggle. Like, I don't think the capitalists will just give that away. They won't give you time on the clock to like engage in emotional relational recovery, generally speaking, unless you work at like a really...
Yeah, unless you're part of that privilege layer of the working class. Like that's really a thing in like well-placed, mostly like startup tech culture, like, because that's a big thing. The problem with that though is that essentially what they're doing is that they are tying your entire emotional and psychic being not to a community, but to a job. And that's like all these tech companies that have like these super like playful offices and like free food and places where you can go and just like chill for a second because work is fucking overwhelming. Like, essentially the reason why they do that is because they are essentially tying your entire life to the company, and they're making it more difficult for you to leave and easier for them to squeeze more work out of.
Yes.
And so that's my biggest problem with this is I don't want capitalist firms to be the overseers of these programs. These have to be separate, and they have to be by and for the working class through collective working class struggle.
Right. So one last thing I want to say too. So she's talking about on page 106, she says, when daring men come to work, loved and loving, the nature of, well, this really tells that she really thinks that patriarchy is the foundation of everything else. She says that if men can come together in a loving way, basically in an anti-patriarchal way, then the nature of work will be transformed, and the workplace will no longer demand that the hearts of men be broken to get the job done. So, like, to me, like, again, I think that's the relationship is backwards, basically, not to be too crude about it, but basically, like, yeah, I don't really think that just by changing men's behaviors and attitudes, for one, I don't even know how possible that is under capitalism, and two, I don't think that that a good strategy to overcoming patriarchy is just to focus on healing men and then work will be transformed. I think we actually need to basically transform work itself and the relations of work itself. So anyway, the reason I bring this up is because I think that I would argue like the sort of notion that Bell Hooks is putting forward of what like a healthy relationship with labor or work would be for men honestly reminds me a lot of what Karl Marx writes about when he talks about species being, right? Like his idea that like we realize our own fulfillment through our relationships with each other. And because we're alienated from the products of our labor right now, we are therefore alienated from each other and from ourselves. But if we could overcome the alienation and like take collective ownership of the economy, then we could actually overcome alienation, whatever, be transformed through each other. I think that's sort of what she's talking about, but I don't think it's possible, without like an economic revolution. But that being said, I guess the reason I think it is still useful to talk about how the relationship between work and patriarchy and men is like, I wonder what a socialist feminist platform would look like. Like what's like the maximum program under that framework, and what are some demands too that people could make? You know what I mean? I do think that, yeah, men should make fucking demands, and we should, I think it would actually behoove us to label it in sort of feminist language and even use the word feminist to say like, we want to overcome like the damage that's been done to us under the system. We think that our common exploiters and oppressors, basically, they need to like provide us with counseling, for example, or whatever. I do have the same worry though about like that being co-opted, but I don't know, I'm curious what you think about that. I don't have like a fully formed thought on it by any means.
I think it would basically look like the first act of Fight Club, except molded into the workplace.
That's probably pretty accurate. So to piggyback a little bit off what Tiberius was saying, I read some of these quotes, and the first thing that I think about is that this is very, very context dependent. I think also on what particular kind of work and what particular kind of workplaces you find yourself in. For example, I work in the nonprofit field, and I'm a social worker, which has historically always been a highly feminized labor force. A lot of the work that we engage in our nonprofit is precisely already co-opting all of these ideas. They aren't structured necessarily and outrightly as a feminist sort of perspective, but they do have this idea that we are going to be better workers through our ability to more emotionally relate to each other. in a healthy way. Like one of the things that I've actually been involved in is some discussions around how to implement what's called the relational-cultural perspective on how we actually structure our workplace. Now, I think there are some really interesting elements that could be pretty radical about this, but at the end of the day, that never really serves to challenge the basic order of how work is structured. It basically is designed to allow for a more smooth and functioning hierarchy within the workplace. So to me, I think we have to be really cautious about this sort of approach. Again, I think it makes a lot of sense, and I understand like where she's coming from, and it's a logical consequence of a lot of the other ideas so far. But at the same time, like I can't help but kind of read this and be like, well, I work in workplaces where they do this, and it doesn't seem to stop anyone being exploited. In some ways, it allows you to be more exploited because you're now like your quote unquote emotional labor is actually being catered to and talked about in a way that I think does make you feel like you can operate more as like on your species being in the workplace. It doesn't seem to really challenge the basic structure of work and exploitation though. So, I mean, that's something that I can't help read this. And I think that is something that's similar in like a lot of the tech companies that Tiberius is talking about. I mean, I think this is a shift in modern management techniques that started in the early 70s. I mean, the other thing I want to put a question back to y'all because, so let's say, for example, I want to connect this up to a past episode we've done that kind of feels in the same ballpark. So we talked about Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown a long time ago. And I remember that in Brown's work and in like pleasure activism, which I know a lot of my good comrades and friends are reading and have read, I think there's this call to be more like loving and caring and sort of, and basically like operate on these almost sort of like virtues whenever you're engaging in organizing work and challenging systems of oppression. And I like that approach. I think it's really necessary. I also read a sentence like, when daring men come to work loved and loving. Now, I can't help but wanting to like step back and be like, well, okay, but hold on a second. Let's like to talk about what being loved and loving are. That's like a philosophical sort of statement to make. And so I'm curious for you two, whenever you read like come to work loved and loving, how do you actually understand what love means in that context? Because to me, I think that would be a helpful thing to actually push on to make this stuff have, I think, more weight, I guess.
I think through reading the book, I do think she actually does provide a decent explanation of how she defines love, but that's something that we lose some of the details when we just talk about it in a podcast form. But to me, I don't know if you're familiar, but I know that she quotes, for one person, she quotes Erich Fromm, who wrote this book called The Art of Loving. He's a philosopher. He
was part of the Frankfurt School. He's kind of a renegade Frankfurt School member and was like a Marxist psychoanalyst. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I read him for philosophy back in my undergrad, so I didn't even know that. It's funny.
Well, I just have to mention this. Fromm is actually what got me into being a Marxist. Reading some of Fromm's work. Yeah.
That's awesome. I remember liking what he wrote about like the art of loving, but basically, so she understands love. I mean, yeah, help me out, Tiberius, but I feel like basically she understands love as, for one, it's an action. It's not just something that you feel. So she shares that insight with Erich Fromm, but also it has a lot to do, I think, for her with like her idea of like being holistic and having like a holistic relationship, not just with yourself, but with your social world and the people around you. And so like basically not having to compartmentalize different parts of yourself in different contexts, but being able to share all the parts of you and let other people share who they are with you. I don't know. That's still vague. So I'm curious if Tiberius has anything to add.
It's kind of an act of radical trust and vulnerability. It's placing your sort of emotional core in the hands of somebody else, essentially, or being willing to do that. So you have to be able to be like honest and vulnerable with yourself first. Sort of what you're doing is you're kind of being honest and vulnerable and open sort of with yourself. Like you said, Comrade Ryan, you're not compartmentalizing part of your core being, your essence, personality, whatever it is, from other people, and you're allowing other people to sort of like, in some sense, take kind of like emotional control, or not control, but emotional sort of possession of your own sort of emotions. You're entering into a relationship where you are sort of like mutually constructing emotional beings together with other people. It's a little bit kind of vague in the book. There's not really a whole lot of like concrete things in the book. This is really more of a call for particularly feminist men to be like doing this for themselves and in their own communities. But that's kind of like the sense that I got. There is a radical amount of loss of control that you have to be willing to have over other people in order to enter into a space of love with them.
So maybe on that note, that brings up another question I wanted to clarify, which is whenever we think about what is it in the workplace that makes it patriarchal, specifically. And so we know how to identify this is what defines a workplace structured on a patriarchal worldview versus not. I was wondering what you two would identify with that, because this is one of the things that I think, just to lay this out, why I'm like, I want to push on a concept like love as an antidote to this, because I think if we leave it vague, and I understand it can be a call to action and maybe it's by nature a hard concept to define. And yet I still want to like push on it and say, okay, but certainly we can say some things about it, because if not, I think it makes it easy to dismiss, especially if you're more of like a sort of like patriarchal man, to just be like, well, fuck that. Like the idea that you just like need to love each other and then everything will be okay is like precisely like a weakness, you know? So I think if there was a clearer way to lay out, if we had a workplace structured like this that wasn't patriarchal, you would see these sorts of things.
I mean, at its core, the notion of love is being put forward here is an intentional letting go of control and dominance. That's sort of like the primary thing that she's trying to get across here, like that the structure of work as it exists under capitalism currently is a structure of control and dominance, and that you cannot have a non-patriarchal, loving relationship based upon these kinds of power imbalances that are sort of like specifically used to get things out of the relationship. And that's kind of where I think it's a little bit weak to say that you can change these under the current system of capitalism, because you don't have capitalism if you don't have methods of control and dominance that are based on fundamental power differences.
So like, yes, it is about letting go of domination, and also the sense of like having to always be in control of your life, but also responsibility is a big part of love for her as well. Responsibility toward yourself and responsibility toward other people as well, which again I think is still vague, but I think it's sort of like along the lines of like, you realize who you are through your relationship, not just with yourself, but with like the people that you care for and the people that you let care for you.
Kind of a duty to care situation.
Yeah.
Do you all think that a co-op is inherently a non-patriarchal style of organizing a workplace?
I'm not necessarily endorsing any of this. I'm just trying to explain what Bell Hooks' like view of love is, which I'm not even claiming to fully understand, but I am trying to give my understanding of it.
I think co-ops divorced from market competition could very well be, but it would have to be a kind of intentional cultural shift that requires the material shift of a move away from market competition and, you know, dominance, because this is an inherently love is an inherently cooperative thing. You can't have competition in love.
Yeah, I'm not so sure. I think you can have some kind of competition. I just think I think cooperation needs to be like sort of like the dominant factor, though, I would say. And like you could have like some fun competition maybe, but as long as it's subordinated to cooperation, at least under Hooks' view, I would say.
Well, I mean, that kind of depends on like what you mean by cooperation and competition, because the competition that I'm specifically thinking of is economic and political competition, specifically over control of resources. And that's kind of inherently what a market is. It is a competition for dominance over societal resources. And in a situation like that, power imbalances are both necessary and inevitable to maintain and to perpetuate. And so in that kind of a situation, you can't have the kind of cooperative, loving, non-patriarchal culture coming out of that. It has to be that kind of culture is inherently antagonistic to those kind of competitive forces. I think you can have like there's a sense in which like if you're running a race against somebody, that can be a non-hierarchical, non-power imbalance kind of competition. if it's not for like specifically material things, or even like cultural capital or whatever. But I think that is maybe getting a little bit far afield from the kind of, and I'm not saying that you're completely wrong. I'm just saying that I'm narrowing my scope of what competition and cooperation means here.
On one note, just one thing I would offer about how love is being defined precisely from a more Marxist left-wing sort of perspective. Whenever I think about her drawing on Fromm, I mean, one thing that's really interesting about that is how Fromm's idea is that under the system of capitalism and market competition, especially for workers, that we are forced to turn ourselves into commodities. We have to become what he called the marketplace self, where essentially you have to construct yourself around social and cultural capital and skills precisely to be a more effective competitor in the marketplace. And another person who I think has also written recently on love, I think in a way that's like pretty interesting and dovetails well with Fromm, is actually Alain Badiou. He has a book called In Praise of Love. And his idea is that love as a truth procedure, as an event, is one of the few things that can actually challenge the dominance of everything being commoditized under global capitalism now. And that in a lot of ways, like I almost wonder if it would actually improve, or it would be something to draw on for particularly us talking about this topic, or people listening, to say, hey, actually maybe to understand what love really means in a very explicitly political framework against capitalism might actually be to draw on someone like Badiou or Fromm, because they define it specifically against this pressure to commoditize and turn ourselves into these like marketplace selves. There's a really good video. I can't help but mention it because it's like a really good distillation of Badiou's thoughts about what love is and how it's anti-capitalist and its core. It's basically him just talking about love that I think like a film student made. I'll put it in the show links whenever we put this one out, because it's a really good, I think, summary of his perspective on it. And it's also a really beautiful video, I think.
All right. Well, I think we should probably move on to the next chapter. It's a good conversation. I guess one thing I want to keep in mind is just like, the question I want to keep raising from now to the end of this discussion is just, are there ways men to organize against capitalism using these ideas? I think actually worker control. So exactly like the demand around like counseling or like support groups or whatever in workplaces, like maybe that could be better if like we demanded like that was put under worker control or whatever, or like that was like part of what our union, like as we need to recognize our union and recognize that our union does this or something. I don't know, just keeping in mind ideas like how can we actually use these ideas to challenge capitalism if there is a way? Because that's a big question I have, because I think like the far right is very good at like recruiting, not even always on purpose, but just recruiting disaffected young men, you know, who have a masculinity crisis. And I just think like the left has a responsibility to counter that if they can.
I just want to offer one thing. I don't know about y'all, but I definitely have a lot of male friends who have started to participate in these like healthy masculinity support groups and like weekend retreats and stuff. And I mean, I do think there are options out there. There's a increasing, I think, visibility of groups that do that. But again, you know, probably no surprise, they're disconnected from any larger like social context outside of one that is like strictly patriarchal in nature. And I'll be honest, I mean, I have friends who go there, but whenever I talk with them, I don't know how much they claim to be feminists, let alone like any sort of like feminist, anti-capitalist, Marxist, anarchist, whatever, you know? So I mean, I think it's important to kind of recognize the support group thing isn't necessarily a solution to this without it being structured in like very particular ways, maybe.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I wasn't even aware that I assume there probably were like men's support groups like that out there, but I was not aware of their existence until you just told me about it.
Yeah, I mean, again, that might be something just, you know, to think about. Because I know we've had this discussion a little bit on the Red Library Discord. It's like, you know, there has to be a way to address these underlying like emotional, psychological, cultural components. And how do we also incorporate this without it just becoming a support group thing? Because, you know, those have been tried, those have existed, like a consciousness raising group. You know, I think the track record on consciousness raising groups isn't all that great. And so how do you think about this stuff in a way that it doesn't become that?
Yeah. Should we go on to chapter 7? Chapter 7 is called Feminist Manhood. Basically, Hook further discusses what she means when she says patriarchal masculinity. And she emphasizes that part of what being a patriarchal man means is to like be isolated from other people. She then develops her concept of feminist masculinity. which she argues should be built by and for men to liberate them from patriarchy. Feminist masculinity is defined as being responsible for one's own self as well as one's communities. It conceives of the self as an interdependent being with all living beings, and it judges a man's strength by a man's ability to foster a holistic self in terms of his relational and relationship building skills. And by building a feminist masculinity, Hooks believes that maleness can be seen as inherently good and life-giving instead of being seen as inherently violent, as she says it is now. I got some questions, but Tiberius or Adam, if you have any thoughts about that?
I mean, no, that's a pretty good summary. We could probably jump into questions on that.
I think the idea of talking about this in relation to species being might be interesting.
Cool.
Get that Dasein.
Well, in no particular order. I didn't really write these questions in a particular order, but the first one is about what would a Marxist say about this. So we can start with that one. So she has a quote on page 115. She says, "Before the realities of men can be transformed, the dominator model has to be eliminated as the underlying ideology in which we base our culture." And, I read that from a certain perspective. My question was like, what do you think a Marxist would say about this? But I'll just broaden and just like, what do you think about that? Like, what do you think about that quote there? So basically what she's saying is like, there's this idea of like masculinity, which is to dominate. And she says like, we need to eliminate that model of male domination, which she says is like the underlying ideology that our culture is based on. And then we can transform the realities of men.
I mean, I think a lot of Marxists would just be screeching idealist at her. Because there is kind of a sense that a theme that runs throughout this book, and maybe it is because she's sort of preferentially analyzing or basing her model on like patriarchy as undergirding these other systems of oppression, that if you change the culture to be anti-patriarchal, then you will fundamentally give rise to sort of like new systems of being and interacting with the self and the society that we are living in. And I don't know, I think it's one of those things where you can't just, maybe it's like one of those kind of prefigurative things, right? Where we do need to change the culture, but in order to change the culture, we have to have a material basis to do it in. So building up these spaces and sort of like radical institutions that are based around these anti-patriarchal ways of being in the world, at least in smaller spaces, as we're fighting to end the systems of domination, we will be better placed to actually end them. Not to say that by creating spaces of anti-patriarchal culture, we will necessarily destroy capitalism, but if we are in a position where we can make real material changes in the world, we will have to have these kinds of cultures sort of ready at hand in order to do it. And it's kind of difficult for me to sort of suss out, like if we're steel manning her argument here, it's a little difficult for me to sort of suss out exactly how she's seeing that kind of relationship between the culture, the base and the superstructure, essentially. Does she see this as changing culture changes the material basis upon which that culture is done? Or there's a chicken and egg problem here, I think.
Yeah, I would largely agree with that. I think that's one of the things that I'm coming away with the biggest question about as we read through this, or just how we're discussing it, is I'm just wondering, to what degree is that kind of the rock that we're still getting stuck on pretty heavily. And the other thing that I would be like really cautious about is like, and maybe to flesh out a little bit more of like why a Marxist would screech, like idealism at this. I think it's similar to the way that toxic masculinity gets talked about now as this overarching like concept about how to describe patriarchal, like misogynistic sorts of behaviors. For example, I was reading a study recently about the way that toxic masculinity gets utilized is usually completely divorced from how certain material contexts tend to reinforce certain practices and behaviors. Whenever you disconnect an idea or a certain psychology, a certain way of being, let's say, from the material context, it then allows that concept to be sort of plastered over everything and utilized in a way that is, I don't want to say like sloppy, but it can be like very incoherent and really understand like how exactly am I supposed to utilize this concept for any sort of like radical revolutionary ends. For example, if I can label everything toxic masculinity, it kind of destroys any sort of like particular way that that concept actually developed, which is that it is in very particular contexts in which that idea was sort of developed and utilized. This is a similar way that Hochschild's concept of emotional labor gets utilized now. Emotional labor was developed by Arlie Hochschild in a very particular way about people who work in very particular sectors of the economy, mostly women. But to then just say that anything that involves dealing with emotional experience or relationships is inherently emotional labor, I think, again, doesn't really help me understand like how that concept allows me to then like utilize it in a critical way to understand certain things about how the social existence that I have, especially as a male, are actually working. So I mean, I guess to me, I would say like, yeah, like maybe it is a little bit idealist, the way that we might be interpreting this, and maybe the way that Hooks understands it. But to then like push it further, I would say that, ideal practices are always built on material practices. And so I would want to just push on us to say, like, how do we then understand how, yeah, these might be like the dominator model might, be useful to think about, but how are we going to think about that if it's disconnected from a set of material practices? Because then it is just ideas in our heads. And then I don't see where else we go except to some kind of prefigurative politics based on that.
Yeah, well, that actually leads me to let's go to the next question. It's related, but I also had like a sort of different particular aspect of bell hooks' argument I wanted to explore with the next question. So the quote on page 113, she says, undoubtedly, one of the first revolutionary acts of visionary feminism must be to restore maleness and masculinity as an ethical, biological category divorced from the dominator model. So I do think that comes from her experience with like second wave feminism of like basically demonizing basically people with penises. And that's how they understood men, essentially. But I guess my question is like, yeah, what do you guys think about this quote? Because I kind of feel like, is it a bit biologically determinist? A part of me is like, yeah, like if it is true that like certain strands of feminism basically view like the male biological category as being like inherently unethical, which I think there are maybe some strands of that. So I could see the appeal then of like, yeah, you would want to actually say like, it's actually completely fine to be biologically male. It's ethical to do so. But I feel like there could be I feel like there should be a distinction between saying that and saying something about what it means to be like a man, first of all, and like a feminist man additionally. Because like, where does that leave non-binary people? Where does it leave trans people, basically, is my question. And like, that's sort of a question, we didn't really talk about it too much throughout this discussion, but I feel like that is just like a big gaping like hole throughout this entire book, honestly. It's just like the absence of non-binary and the absence of trans politics. So I'm curious, I don't know if I'm reading too much into this quote in particular, but I kind of wanted to use it as like a starting off point to like get into that discussion about how we feel about her basically lack of discussion around a fuller concept of gender.
I don't think it's wrong to say that this is too biologically determinist. I think what the main problem that I'm having here is that what she's trying to do is she's trying to decouple the feudalistic, capitalistic methods of masculinity that come out of these, societal needs for dominator roles, and to try and decouple that from the biological category of male. Mm-hmm. But she's not taking it far enough. And I think that is tied into maybe the sort of, second wave grounding that she has in her feminism, and in particular, the sort of glaring lack of trans and queer analysis that is happening in her feminism in this book, to say that, okay, well, we can actually strip masculinity from its biological essence, essentially, to try and step back and say, once we do start stripping these kinds of dominator models out of masculinity, and to try to not have them tied so deeply to the fact that you have a penis, there is a huge question of, well, then, if these are categories and ways of being, which both men and women, non-binary, trans people, or cis, whatever it is, can be a part of, well, then it's not really masculinity per se anymore. And so the thing that I'm seeing with this is that this is a good way to start talking about these kinds of issues in decoupling what it means to be a masculine patriarch, and what it means to have a certain kind of biology, but it kind of stops because there's really no further analysis of coupling gender and biology.
So was one thing you just said, was it about, did you say that this sort of redefining of masculinity, if we could include like non-binary people in that redefinition, then it's not really masculinity anymore? Is that what was that something you just said?
Well, I mean, because what she's kind of doing here is that she's stripping out the dominator model of masculinity and sort of adding in the more stereotypically feminine qualities of love and vulnerability and cooperation, and allowing the masculine to have those traits as well. And it's unclear on what is left that is strictly masculine, and why that should continue to be tied to a certain biological essence.
Yeah, for sure. That actually leads into my last question on the chapter. Well, before I get to that, I do want to read this quote first, just to see if we have any thoughts on it. So this is still related to the discussion we were having. And she says that many of the critics who have written about masculinity suggest that we need to do away with the term, that we need an end to manhood. Yet such a stance furthers the notion that there is something inherently evil, bad, or unworthy about maleness. My question to that was like, okay, it seems like there is kind of a point here, but I also wonder if like both the position that she's critiquing and her own position might be falling just too far into like this like idealist word game, essentially. So curious if you two have thoughts on that. But I do feel like that speaks to your point, Tiberius, about how like this could be a good starting point for the discussion, especially to decouple biology from like our toxic or notions of patriarchal masculinity. But still have that question about biological determinism, and it's just basically just an idealist word game at this point, as opposed to like it could fall into that. But I feel like there is like I think we can salvage this to like be a materialist project as well. But curious if you two have thoughts on it.
Chairman Bain, if I took off your mute, would it hurt?
It would be extremely painful.
You're a big guy.
For you. I'm really glad that just got included. It's funny. I'm actually thinking back to a class I did in my undergrad that was on the sociology of identity. And I remember having us a discussion about gender and situation and identity and how all these things relate. And I do think, like, whenever we talk about something being an idealist word game, I think about how certain concepts of, like, let's say masculinity in this respect. I'm going to try to, like, make this hopefully relevant and efficient. I guess to me, the question is, are we then going to, like, to push this further and make it material? We have to understand that the way that gender has been connected to sexual identity in this biologically essentialist determinist way also necessitates it's defined in this particular patriarchal framework. So, I mean, I think I've seen multiple ways to approach this. Is the idea that we should say that certain, like, quote unquote personality traits are actually dispersed relatively, universally across all people's experiences, but the thing that we have to be aware of is how we tend to, like, stereotype or coalesce them into one particular gender identity, and then that's like something that kind of fits within a patriarchal sort of system. So, I mean, is the idea that, well, if the solution is to then say, well, we need to make sure that we recognize that all identities can have certain traits, like, how does that relate to biological essentialism then? Does it really get us out of it? Does it not? And I don't know if this is kind of what you two are thinking, but it's one of the ways I remember engaging with this sort of criticism is what are we after here? Is this where we start talking about the abolition of gender categories as such? Is it the idea that, maybe it's just a way to like complicate how we tend to sort of like stereotype identities into like a certain set of traits. You know, I don't know. I don't have good answers on this. That's why I'm mostly kind of curious. I'm always curious to hear other people's thoughts, you know, because based on my own identity, it's like, it's always hard for me to step back and think about how much am I socialized into seeing things in a particular way, and how do I see like ways to get around that? Because, you know, I guess based on our first discussion in the first episode, you know, I was kind of talking about how in a lot of ways, a lot of the things that tend to define being masculine, like I don't really identify with a lot of those at all. And so I think it's always left me with an open question of how do I approach this topic? And I'm not really sure I have good answers yet. I think my approach has mostly been to kind of recognize that I might have a set of traits that don't tend to fit into like, you know, the standard biologically essentialist male and female categories, or masculine and feminine categories maybe.
There's a meme that goes around in the queer community, particularly, you know, lesbian, trans lesbian communities, of the butch femme continuum. You know, the first time I saw that years ago, it's kind of just like a joke, and I thought it was maybe a little bit mean-spirited in the way that it sort of like treats certain women as men. But the more I sort of sat with that kind of idea, that notion, it makes a lot more sense to sort of treat these in continua that you might, based upon your biology, sort of skew in one direction or another, but that is specifically about women, trans and cis. And to say that, you know, you have your stereotypical masculine woman over on one side and your stereotypically feminine woman on the other, and in that kind of analysis, really the only difference between, and sometimes even not then, like the only real difference in one end of the spectrum or another is in kind of like affectation, presentation, the sort of socially defined categories of behavior that are almost entirely decoupled from what happens to be going on in between your legs. And so that's kind of why I think there is a utility in allowing masculinity to have these much broader, sort of varied, positive connotations allowed to be put into it again. But there is also that exact same kind of limitation where the mapping of masculinity onto certain biological traits is sort of inherently propping up this kind of biological determinism, and doesn't allow us as well, or might even be kind of counterproductive in allowing us to sort of like decouple the socially defined characteristics of what masculinity is and like the biologically determined characteristics of like sex presentation, essentially.
I mean, in some ways, this reminds me of some critiques that came after Foucault and like Poststructuralism, which was to say that even assigning certain social meanings onto like sexual characteristics, that in itself like is the problem, you know. And that at least if we think about this in a kind of like utopian way, and maybe we talked about this on part one, but you know, there are at least ways to conceptualize what it would be like to organize society where those two things were completely decoupled. Like it didn't really make any sense to assign certain values onto certain like biological aspects of one's being, like, you know, whatever your sexual organs are. It's like there isn't inherently anything that necessitates that. It is interesting to me because whenever I think about a lot of the men I know who, like, let's say participate in those support groups I was mentioning to you, Comrade Ryan, I think that their approach is to say, well, we just need to broaden like this continuum of what it is to be men so it includes these other traits. And yet at the same time, it doesn't ever really seem to call into question the category of being men in the first place. It's just like, again, trying to enlarge it in a certain way. But I mean, on that note, I mean, one of the things that I always think about that I found, you know, not always, but sometimes a useful category is the idea of hegemonic masculinity, and how the idea is like no one technically fits into that. Like it's like this sort of abstract category that is used to sort of police certain kinds of expression and behaviors and presentation of masculinity, but no one like really technically fits into it. To me, it's an open question how to fit all these things together, but it's something else I was thinking about of like, how do people actually try to grapple with this in terms of, again, enlarging the continuum, I guess.
It actually does lead to the final question I had in this chapter. Should the project be to redefine manhood in the way you were just talking about, or should the project be we want to just abolish gender as a social construct. I'm curious what you two think about that question. I feel like the question itself might have some baked in assumptions that maybe we can critique. But one thing I'll say is, like, I don't really have an answer to this question. It's something I genuinely want to hear your thoughts on it. But I also, if I were to sort of think about like why one would want to like redefine masculinity or redefine manhood, especially under capitalism, and have that be like not just a cultural project, but like try to make it a political project as well, I would say that, I don't know, I guess I just sort of think again of like disaffected men who are very susceptible to the far right, for example. And I think about like, yeah, I feel like a lot of people on the far right, like Jordan Peterson, for example, I mean, he's sort of like a gateway drug to the far right, can just really well like speak to that disaffection of men, and like they can just be like, here's the reason why. Here's why your life sucks. It's because women are fucking horrible or something like that. And I just feel like, well, we should speak to the ways in which patriarchy harms men specifically. Like we should raise like, yeah, why is like the suicide rate so much higher for men as opposed to women, for example, and just like raise things like that. And maybe for some people, like they do have like even, I would argue like most men probably, even if they don't really consciously identify with it, I think probably most men do have like unconscious like identification with manhood, and obviously myself included for sure. Because of that, I just wonder, like, you know, basically if that's our audience, like they might not want to just be like, yeah, fuck it, I don't want to be a man anymore. I want to like completely abolish that reality. So in terms of meeting people where they're at, I wonder if that's like a better strategy. So I don't know, curious what you two think about that.
So one question I would ask, and I'm actually reminded of a second wave feminist political project, which was wages for housework. You know, whenever you read of like the history of this and this call to say that, you know, essentially care work, household labor should be compensated just as much as any other, you know, job that you have in a workplace. You know, my understanding of the history of this sort of call was that like it was almost like it was never designed, or it was never intended to be like something that you would like realistically construct like a political policy and legislation and then try to have this passed. But it was a sort of orienting point that points towards like redefining or overturning certain assumptions that we have. And so I don't know. I mean, I think like whenever I think about the men in my life and the men, like, let's say, just to keep it real 100, you know, the people that I know back home, right? If you were to go to them, and even if you were to help them identify like, hey, here are all the reasons why the suicide rates around like your hometown are so incredibly high, like why substance use is just like absolutely devastating everybody, the reason why you like can't find a job, and like, you know, all these like materialist sort of Marxist critiques, and then they connect it up to this sort of role of patriarchy. You know, if you were to like then say, okay, well, the solution I'm offering, or the thing I have as a way out of this, is the sort of abolition of gender categories completely, like what would they say? You know, and these are people who tend to be spoken to by a lot of those right-wing sort of criticisms of people like Peterson. Just like practically, I don't think that they would probably like have any interest. I think they do identify so strongly with manhood that it was like, that isn't something they want to give up. There's like a wages of maleness maybe, or there's a certain way that you have been so thoroughly defined by this. You know, the idea that you would then give that up is to give up some like absolutely fundamental core piece of your entire sense of being and like identity and subjectivity, you know? So even just like putting aside the question of should that be the project, or should that be the goal or not? I mean, practically, I just don't think a lot of the people that I know who typically are very susceptible to right-wing arguments would not appeal to them in any way, which isn't to say it shouldn't be the goal. I'm just thinking about like, that's kind of what I imagine in those conversations. So I wonder though, if the like abolition of gender categories might sort of function in a similar way to the wages for housework thing. Like, is it sort of this like utopian, like horizon principle that, you know, the idea is like, well, maybe isn't going to be the thing that we could achieve, but it orients us in a particular way. And so I don't know what y'all think about that as an idea, but it's something I'm kind of curious about myself.
Well, then the first thing I should say is that looking at successful suicide rates alone isn't really sufficient to understand kind of what's going on. In many situations, women actually have higher suicide attempt rates. Men are socialized to essentially use much more violent and immediately lethal methods of suicide. So their success, quote unquote, success rates of carrying out a suicide are much higher than women. But this is something that is a trend that is fairly recent. And it's in particular, for the same reasons that men have high suicide rates, is that women are being subjected to the exact same kinds of alienating, dehumanizing modes of oppression within the existing market forces, essentially. But the other thing is that the wages for housework thing is kind of an interesting parallel to draw, because that in and of itself isn't, I think, the sort of like utopian vision. It's an accelerationist vision, because if capital is forced to essentially absorb all of its negative externalities, it would collapse. Capitalism cannot fully pay within its own system of currency for everything that it does, including the value captured by the labor of creating and perpetuating the working class, essentially. So in doing so, you're either pushing capitalism into a place where it can no longer function as a system, or showing the inherent contradictions within capitalism to say that if we were to make the system more fair, we would destroy the system itself. So that might be a way to kind of think about the ways in which we're talking about opening up masculinity to these entirely new and stereotypically feminine ways of being. So that if you are to essentially take the stereotypical feminine traits and allow masculinity to be those as well, to say that you can be vulnerable, emotional, loving, connected, cooperative, and be masculine, it kind of calls into, like I've been saying, it calls, and it's the reason the sort of like pathway for me, once I had a bit of I don't know what I am, like questioning my own masculinity. This is part of it, is to try and understand like what masculinity means, if masculinity can be anything. So that it might be like a gender accelerationist kind of mode or project, essentially.
I really like that. That is a super helpful way to reframe like how exactly that's functioning. So that's good shit, Tiberius.
So I'm going to propose that for chapter 8, I just read the summary and then we just move on. I don't think we have to talk about it. This was sort of a weirdly placed chapter to me, just to speak about the book for a second. It just was like, so this chapter is about patriarchal masculinity in media, which is something that she touches on earlier in the book too, but it just feels kind of oddly placed to me. I feel like this should have been placed earlier, perhaps, when she was beginning her characterization of patriarchal masculinity, because like now she's, especially right after this chapter, she moves on to like, well, she's already moved on to talk about like what would a feminist masculinity be. And now it just feels kind of weird to be like, and now here's how masculinity looks in popular media. So I'm just going to summarize it real quick, and I think we can move on. This chapter is called Popular Culture, Media, Masculinity. Basically, she critiques several television shows and movies which put forth patriarchal messages. And she argues like The Incredible Hulk is like a good example of this. Like timid white guy scientist who, when he gets mad, he becomes a colored giant violent beast, which basically she's arguing like has not just patriarchal undertones, but racist ones as well, which I thought was just an interesting way of looking at it. She connects like her critiques of media with racism and also the use of black men to divert attention away from like white patriarchal violence. So she talks about gangster rap and stuff like that, for example, which of course, financed by like rich white guys. She concludes by arguing for, basically, she thinks that we need a new popular culture, which exemplifies a feminist masculinity. I think we move on to chapter 9, though, if you guys are okay with that.
Well, before we do, I would just like to say that basically what she's doing with this chapter is calling upon everybody to watch and make more Steven's Universe. Particularly Steven Universe Future, which is great. I cannot stress highly enough how much I love that show, and especially because part of what that second series of Steven Universe is kind of doing is sort of struggling with the effects of the kind of like violence and trauma that was displayed in the first season, and to actually grapple with it. There's a section of it in which Steven Universe is essentially trying to dig into his like patriarchal masculine side, to try and lean into that as a way of coping with past trauma. And it is something that is further traumatizing him. And in order to sort of like break that, he has to then pull back from this notion of masculinity and sort of like rediscover a much more vulnerable and cooperative and loving mode of masculinity. And it's actually really interesting what's going on with that. That's basically what she's saying here, is that, you know, the people who are defined as masculine need role models that are not this kind of patriarchal masculinity, like personified. And yeah, I mean, sure, that's good. It's not...
No disagreements here, bell hooks.
Yeah. It's like the entire book is essentially like an expansion on that chapter, which, you know, I agree with Comrade Ryan in this sense. It's kind of weird. It's where it's placed. It feels like it would have been much better placed earlier on, but I think in order to get to that, she felt like she had to have more of an analytical buildup to it. But by the time you actually get to that chapter, it becomes kind of redundant.
Yeah.
One other thing, and I know we could probably talk about representations of masculinity in media all day, but I do want to invoke here something that might be important to consider for us and then for anyone listening to this episode, is the sort of the importance of grappling with psychoanalytic approaches to masculinity and the unconscious here. Because whenever I think about portrayals of masculinity and misogyny in particular, one of the most interesting films that comes to mind is actually the film, it's a Denis Villeneuve film called Enemy with Jake Gyllenhaal. Have y'all seen this?
No.
I'd highly
I haven't.
recommend it. I think it is actually one of the most interesting portrayals of masculinity and the unconscious that I've seen. It's actually based on a novel by Jose Saramago, who I can't remember. I think he's from Argentina maybe. But anyway, I think this film is on Netflix, and it's very interesting because it's a portrayal of this sort of weird, uncanny experience of Jake Gyllenhaal's character, who is, he's a professor. He's kind of this awkward loner who teaches about, I believe it's about authoritarianism. And it's essentially a depiction of how he becomes aware of an actual like complete like doppelganger of himself, who is sort of like embodying all these like highly patriarchal, like misogynistic traits of masculinity that he does not embody. And then it's a really interesting exploration of how I think like the unconscious nature of this sort of like patriarchal misogynistic socialization like tends to operate in the unconscious. And I think that the portrayal of it as like a doppelganger and this uncanny experience, which is directly tied to Freud, I think is a really interesting one. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that on some level, I think part of what we do have to grapple with is, even reading this book, I think we have to be very cautious about how orienting like our ego around the idea that we're non-patriarchal doesn't necessarily address like the way that the unconscious is sort of structured around a similar sort of way that like we think about dominance and drive and all this other stuff. So that's probably too huge for us to get into, but I do think that film is an interesting portrayal of the relevance of, I think, a psychoanalytic critique for this sort of stuff too.
Might be a good idea for movie night roundtable episode.
Sorry, I was muted and I couldn't get to it fast enough. Yes, I think that would actually be a fascinating thing for us to watch together after these episodes, for sure.
I'll just say that she offers actually a lot of really, really interesting and really cool critiques of media. So I just highly recommend people check that out. For me, it gave me like a really nice like arsenal and tool set, I guess, just to like read media differently now. For example, like when I saw Joker, I could not help but view it in like the sort of like patriarchal lens that Bell Hooks puts forward, but I viewed it as like a good thing. I viewed it as like a critique of masculinity, and I have Bell Hooks to thank for that, honestly, to be able to read media in that way. So despite the fact that I am glossing over this chapter quickly, I just want to say, like, it is, I think, quite useful. So, chapter 9, Healing Male Spirit. So, in this, she basically, she gets all spiritual on us. She argues that male spirituality should be, well, first of all, she understands male spirituality as being full of compassion, kindness, and relations with others. And she says that we need to heal this spirituality from men, from the violent and the violence-producing effects of patriarchy. I don't know how much we really need to talk about this chapter either. I'm actually kind of inclined to move through it fairly quickly, but I'll ask the one question that I wrote down for it, which is that Hooks argues that forgiveness from women is actually key for men to engage in this spiritual healing that she talks about. How do you understand the role of forgiveness in this process, either from men, women, non-binary people, and self-forgiveness as well? Because, one thing she says is that men cannot speak their pain in a patriarchal culture. Curious, the role of forgiveness, I guess, in a male spirituality as she understands it.
I think forgiveness is incredibly important. I mean, forgiveness is like is one of the fundamental cores of restorative justice. And this is kind of what she's talking about, like without actually, I think, spelling it out directly. Essentially what she's calling for is like a reckoning of the imposed system of masculine, feminine, binary existence. And because we're all implicated in that to a certain extent. We are men, women, masculine, feminine, even like non-binary trans people still are implicated in the system of patriarchy as it exists because it is so pervasive. In order to be able to move beyond that, you can't have a kind of punitive model of redressment that essentially is recapitulating the patriarchal model of justice. It has to be one based upon forgiveness and growth. It is not sufficient to have, essentially the feminine forgive the masculine without having the masculine actually work towards redressing its own complicity in patriarchal domination. But it is fundamentally necessary for it to happen. There has to be a way towards forgiveness and reconciliation if we are to move beyond the patriarchal duality, essentially. And I think that is what she's pointing us towards in this chapter.
Yeah, I think this particular question is a really, really personal one and hits home in a lot of ways. I think that overall, my way of thinking about the role of forgiveness is it's a necessary but not sufficient condition. One of the things that I've had to grapple with pretty directly is, I've mentioned, I think maybe on part one, but I know I've mentioned in other episodes, I worked with a lot of women, mostly like working class, poor women of color who have really, really severe histories of trauma and violence, almost without exception, all related to intimate partner violence, domestic violence, physical abuse, sexual abuse by men. And one of the things that is always the most challenging thing to grapple with as, a man, as a cis heterosexual man, is to always to recognize how, whether you want to or not, you are a stand-in for that entire history and this entire system. And in some ways, one of the things that is most, in terms of a spiritual faith-based sort of framework of forgiveness that I've actually seen is most harmful is whenever someone basically in their life, usually in a faith-based community, will tell them that, oh, you've been violently brutalized by this system or by these men in your life. Well, you just need to forgive them to move on because that's the only way to heal. And I think that there's a certain way that actually continues to perpetuate the exact trauma and violence that they've experienced. So I think that in some way, there's a certain degree where you have to accept a way to grapple with your own role in the system if you're a man, and to also, I think, have to accept the fact that you may never be forgiven for the system and the thing that you're a part of, and I think in my own experience, and this is just very, clinical as a therapist, one of the things that you do have the chance to do is to provide some sort of corrective experience, or at least to provide some sort of relationship that shows that it doesn't have to be defined in this violent patriarchal way. To me, I think that's been something that's been really amazing to be a part of and to be able to directly speak to the role of violence and patriarchy and what men in their life have done and why. And this is something I can tell you I've heard verbatim. There is no justice for what these men have done. So why the hell should I ever forgive them whenever there is no justice for what they've done? And to be honest, I think the only thing to say is to be yeah, it's up to you if you decide you want to forgive the men in your life. No one else can decide to do that for you. So I think we have to recognize that. And maybe this comes back to a discussion we've had on the Discord about being an ice cold motherfucker about all this. I think part of that and being like that doesn't mean to be emotionally dead. I think part of what it does mean is you have to grapple and reckon with the fact that because you are part of the system, whether you like it or not, you may never be forgiven. And can you be okay with that and still continue to try to operate in a different way, exactly as Hutz is describing, without it being contingent upon you being forgiven, which is really a way to gratify your own sort of like narcissistic urges, I think, to like feel like, oh, I want to be the good man, right? Because I think that's also something that has to be really cautioned against. Like this can also become a weirdly like self-serving, like egotistical sort of impulse. Like it can take on the guise of all this stuff that Hutz is talking about. And I think that has to be something that you're really aware of if you're going to sort of, try to operate in a different way that isn't so defined by patriarchy.
You are not a savior.
Yeah, exactly.
Much as you want, you're the manure of history, not the plowman.
Thank you. That is a great connection to make. This is, I think, precisely where that kind of switching of the conceptualization is really, really important around like feminist critique and against critiques of patriarchy.
Yeah, those are all great points. Chapter 10 is called...
Before we do, though, I kind of want to just get this quote in here. Which is from 146. Since shaming is often used to socialize boys away from their feeling of selves and toward the patriarchal male mask, many men have grown to have an internal shaming voice. And I think that is something that, like, I think the reason why this kind of language is in this chapter is precisely because it is incredibly difficult, if you have been socialized in that, to then let go of that internalized shame. And part of what her forgiveness narrative is about is allowing the masculine to let go of that shame, to understand that shame is essentially like the internalization of non-forgiveness, right? It's to sort of understand and like hold on to your own guilt. And in order in this narrative, in order to allow yourself to relinquish that guilt, you must be forgiven. And because it is so internalized and is so beaten into the masculine under patriarchy that this shame is a part of you always, it is a huge hurdle in order to get through that on your own. And I don't necessarily think, as you're saying, Adam, that that forgiveness necessarily has to come from women in particular. I think that forgiveness can come from within the masculine in some senses, in community, essentially, like with the masculine itself, that men can work towards understanding their own position and sort of forgiving themselves in some sense, in order to allow them to get past the shame. It's a lot of like the white guilt kind of thing. Like it's not helpful to have that, to hold on to that kind of guilt as a part of your identity in attempting to sort of abolish that, what you have been socialized into having an identity and the position within society that holds.
I think there's a really crucial thing to talk about. And briefly, I guess, whenever I think about my own experiences of shame and masculinity and how we've been socialized, I think it's important here that Hutz uses the word mask. And, it's not an accident that the original word for person is persona, which means a mask you wear. It was a mask on a stage. And so I think there's a way that we have to understand that our sense of self in this sort of patriarchal system is one that is as if we have adopted a mask. And part of the policing of that, or the sort of way that power functions in a sort of like Foucauldian way, is precisely to say that, shame is a way that I think it operates kind of in two capacities. One, there's a way that like men, I think, shame each other, because the idea is like, if you don't wear this mask in this particular way, you are not valid, or you are not worthy of being a person. Like there's a sense of like dehumanization that occurs. And there's also the way too that I think, especially as like, if you're, heterosexual, like there's a way that the idea is like, well, if I don't wear this mask, I'm going to be barred from any sort of like love and intimacy and even like sexual relationships with women. I wonder like how like there's a sort of like twofold component of this. It's like, it might be chicken or the egg, right? It's like, how many of us really police ourselves and the shame functions in this way, precisely to say that, well, if I don't have some way to feel like a valid subject, it's like I am going to be even more isolated and alone and have no emotional intimacy and no ability to feel loved and cared for in any sort of way. So I think that like the shame piece like functions in these two like different ways to me. And I think that that's why it's so important to say that this forgiveness maybe not only can, but maybe has to come from other men in a sort of communal way as well. Because without that, we're not addressing the fact that we police each other and we exert symbolic violence upon each other and physical violence upon each other if we don't wear this mask in the right way. And so to me, I think that has to be a part of it.
Yep, really great points all around. She says that men can heal their spirits by developing relational skills, the ability to experience empathy and to care for others. So like later on, we might get to this again, but I just wanted to emphasize this now. I think she has a really good quote later on. I think she's actually quoting someone else. Basically, the idea is that men need to organize, or they need to like, basically like we need to challenge patriarchy, not just because it's the right thing to do, or not even because we want women to like be free, which like, yeah, sure, we want those things. But like really we should do it because we recognize that we can only be free by doing that. We have an onus on ourselves. Like if we actually want to become liberated, like we have a responsibility basically to do that. I don't know if that made sense, but
yeah, no. And I think that is exactly the kind of thing that we talk about in other contexts in a broader working class context. It's not enough to say that we need to work towards the liberation of other people. There has to be an understanding that your liberation is contingent upon the liberation of other people as well as yourself. We have to seek liberation from these systems of oppression, because even if we are sort of nominally within the category of the oppressor, because these are very hierarchical systems, we are ourselves part of an oppressed group within the oppressor class. And in order for us to be liberated, we have to recognize that this oppressive category is not just bad for the oppressed, and it is sort of by definition worse for the oppressed class, but it is also bad for those who are not necessarily at the heights of the oppressor category, right? That has to be understood as like gradations of harm and oppression. That
yeah.
these aren't solid binary categories.
So real quick, I just want to skip ahead. It's like actually on the last page, 186 to 187. I just want to read this quote because when we're talking about forgiveness, this is sort of what made me think about this. It's just like, and Adam's points about like how like men have to forgive ourselves internally, but also have to forgive each other. I think this is why. So she's actually quoting someone named Kaylee Hagan, and she says that men perceive the value of a feminist practice for themselves. And she's talking about like how men should basically perceive the value of feminist practice. And they advocate for it not because it's politically correct or because they want women to like them or even because they want women to have equality, but because they understand that male privilege prevents them not only from becoming whole, authentic human beings, but also from knowing the truth about the world. And they offer proof that men can change. So that was one of my favorite quotes of the book, actually. Just there is a self-interest, and we need to figure out ways, I think, to like highlight that, to show that to men, and to somehow incorporate that into our organizing. Like there is actually a self-interest for men to challenge and overcome patriarchy. So chapter 10 is called Reclaiming Male Integrity. So I'll just go over that summary real quick, and then we can move on to the last chapter, and we can just talk about both of them at the same time. So chapter 10 is Reclaiming Male Integrity. So integrity is a big part of like her feminist manhood. She says that men basically live compartmentalized lives in order to, 1, avoid the pain of psychic patriarchal harm, and 2, to conform to patriarchal manhood. Starting with this assertion, she goes on to argue for a new conception of masculinity and manhood. As opposed to a fractured and compartmentalized being, she says that healing can only happen through a process of integration, which means becoming a man of integrity. In order to engage in this process of integration, men need to be allowed to grieve for their past selves so that room can be made for their new selves to begin. To be a man of integrity is to actively choose So like, this is important. We actively choose our values to unite the different parts of oneself into a complete being, and to be responsible both to ourselves and to others, and thus to be able to change through a mutual process of critique and affirmation. Yep, basically, I'll leave it at that, and then we'll move on. So chapter 11 is Loving Men. This final chapter, she explains the connection between raising patriarchal men and our war-driven culture. So to me, this is actually the chapter that gets closest, or I think to me, like, this is like the most radical aspect of her characterization of patriarchy, because she talks about its connection to imperialism. So she talks about how there's a connection between raising men who are patriarchal and our culture of war, basically. And she ultimately argues that men will need several different kinds of communities of resistance and healing to support them in their journey to reclaiming masculinity. And it's only through communal support that men can create themselves as loving, healing, and healed, relational, passionate people. And this would create a healthy relation with sex for men, and as well as all of other men's relationships. So those are the final two chapters. So I'm just curious what you all think about that, and we can also talk about the book as a whole too to wrap up.
Well, I think that the acknowledgement that grief and the ability to grieve is kind of integral to this process, because masculinity, and specifically patriarchal masculinity, is so bound up into the male identity that is socialized, basically starting from birth and reinforced often through both physical and emotional violence throughout our lives. Getting beyond that is, in a sense, like losing part of your identity. There is a palpable sense of loss, at least like for me. Like I spent like a number of years sort of feeling a sense of loss and almost like grief at sort of recognizing that I no longer had a kind of connection to masculinity in a way that I was sort of like raised to understand, and then trying to understand and feel emotionally like what that actually meant. It's a real and palpable sense, like part of your identity, part of your core self has died. And in order to move beyond that, you have to give yourself, you have to have a space for you to grieve that part of yourself. That was, I think that's paralleled in one of the stories she quotes at the beginning of the book of a really violent patriarchal father who had died, and his daughter found herself both glad and relieved that he was dead, but also grieving deeply for his loss. And there is a kind of internal parallel to that, I think, when you have to, or when you recognize that part of yourself no longer really exists in the same way that it once does or did, and that can be sensed as kind of a loss of self and needs to be grieved in a way.
Yeah, I think that is a really crucial point. Is, again, there's a sort of psychic death that has to come about in this process. And I think it needs to be stated pretty clearly that that's not only what to expect and why this is so difficult to engage around this topic, and also to understand why people violently defend it to the degree that they do. Because to challenge this is to psychically threaten someone at the most core part of their existence. And it shouldn't be any surprise why, a lot of men who are really socialized deeply into this way are going to protect it, sometimes violently. Thinking about this in terms of other discussions we've had around like dialectical pessimism and left-wing melancholia, I mean, this connection between like how we are socialized as men for war and like in this imperialist framework is really key here, because one of the things that I have seen most often on the left with other men is this sort of libidinal investment in like violence and revolution as like a way to engage in war without having to be part of the military. It's like there is something deeply alluring about that if you're not operating with this critique. And I think it not only leads to just like political dead ends, but I think it also deeply alienates people around you and leads to serious errors in organizing and in political analysis. So for me, it's a way that like the political is personal as well. And it really does shape like your political analysis if you're not aware of how you're deeply socialized in a certain way. I think this is necessary to also help, especially other men, get out of like that left-wing melancholia sort of framework. I guess the last thing I'll say, just kind of trying to wrap up, is that I'm not really sure how I feel about this, just to state it outright, but I do think that it's no surprise that Hutz's argument ends on a sort of like a virtue politics at the end, and is to say that, you know, what this really eventually lands on is a sort of kind of like a sense of self and identity that is built around virtues in this Aristotelian way. Again, I'm not really sure what I think about that, because in some ways, I do think there is a way that like virtues, quote unquote, and thinking about like what sort of virtues might be most embodied in like a really effective, like anti-capitalist, Marxist, leftist, I don't even care what you call it, but like some sort of critique like that, I think is really important and can be really helpful. I just also wonder if not basing it solely, like not having your analytical focus be on the material, like relations of capital and production and the economy. It's almost like, what else are you going to end on but a politics of virtue? And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I just wonder if it's, again, like a sort of really useful and vital thing that we have to have. It just isn't also going to fundamentally challenge the larger systems of oppression based in the material relational productions and economy that will allow us to be most effective. I mean, maybe we need it, but it just isn't the sole be-all, end-all of what we actually need.
I think that's a really good point of analysis on the book, where like we've been, I think, really critical of this book. And I think that, you know, some people might read that as saying that like we don't like this book. And at least for me, that's not true. I think that this is actually a really good book for a kind of introductory path into thinking about this thinking about in particular feminism and patriarchal masculinity in a much more holistic way, to sort of understand not just understand the system, not just from the side of the oppressed, but from the side of the oppressor as well, and to try and find a way to air horns dialectically synthesize that into a way to try to move beyond it. And I think that our biggest critiques of this book is not that this is a bad project or that she's doing it wrong necessarily, but that it's not continuing. There is a sense of what she's trying to do is still very bound up within the system as it exists, as a way to kind of reform the system from within in order to break the system. And it feels very sort of like social democratic-y to me, where I don't see from where this book stops how to get to that point of rupture to then move beyond the system. But I think that this gives us a really solid place to sort of start and to understand what that horizon or where that horizon might be located so that we can orient ourselves to it.
Yeah. So I guess one of the closing questions is just, what do we think the relevance of this book is for today, and what can the left take from this book? Yeah, I agree. We gave some pretty good critiques of the book. For me, I feel like a lot more research that I would want to do is like more of a material analysis of gender, looking at, I'm curious to read more like from more feminist theory and more Marxist feminist theory as well. But in terms of the relevance for today, I agree with Tiberius that this can be a really good sort of jumping off point or a starting point for thinking about gender politics through the lens of like, a critique of patriarchy. But I'm curious what you all think about this question. Like, what can the left, and I think this would be a good note to end on, is just like, what can the left take from this now? Because I guess the thing that I've been really trying to grapple with is how much potential is there for organizing against capitalism? And like, what role does cultural struggle, I guess, the culture wars, what role does that play in the revolutionary process? Because I do think ultimately we need a social revolution where, the means of production are seized. And I think really only then would we be able to see a lot of these like changes that we want to see regarding, the relations of gender.
Comrade Ryan, are you saying we need a cultural revolution?
Yes, we need a cultural revolution. Yes, we also need a social revolution and a political revolution and all that. But yeah, I guess I'm curious. Yeah, what role? Because I feel like honestly, I feel like for the left now, the most important thing that we can and should be doing is like organizing the working class as the working class. But I also feel like that's not mutually exclusive with organizing working class men on the level of culture. And I feel like that can have like a mutually beneficial relationship with our other organizing struggles. While it's true that she talks about, she sort of defines manhood, like a positive manhood in terms of virtues. I do think that is true. She defines it in terms of traits and stuff like that. But she also says that it can only be a collective process, And I think that's one of the strengths of her book that is like, I would say is sort of demarcates her from more liberal feminism. Not to say that she's still not liberal in many ways, but she's also less liberal than a lot of liberal feminists that sort of don't take into account the fact that, transformation needs to be a collective process.
So the other thing that I'm hearing is that we need to combat bell hooks' liberalism.
We're just, full Mao today. Just full on.
I think that, I think I largely agree with what you're saying. And I think that some of the places where she is proposing us to start are probably just, if not in themselves kind of revolutionary, just, I think, very smart places to start in our own organizing, to create systems of support and love within our own institutions on the left as a way to combat the kind of alienation and perpetuation of dominance that has for so long been like part of the root of why our projects continuously fall apart. ISO is a great example of this, as a recent example of an organization that fell apart in very large part because it did not have this. It did not have internally a culture of love and support. And it did not do enough to intentionally, I think, did not do enough to critique and attempt to overcome, even in a limited way, the kind of patriarchal masculinity that is pervasive in leftist spaces, because it's pervasive in the material context that those leftist spaces are operating within.
Yeah, I guess I'll just say that in terms of the critiques of this, I think it's important to be able to understand that critique isn't necessarily always aimed to destroy. Like, critique is sometimes aimed to refine, and actually I think does like operate in a way that can be like, in some sense, like kind of like loving in the way that she's talking about. To me, I think about the necessity to, in terms of what Eve Sedgwick would call like have like a paranoid reading where you are critiquing things and based on its assumptions, but then you can also like engage in a reparative reading, which is to sort of understand like what does this book, what are the possibilities of actually relating it to, a sort of an approach that is based more on sort of like not just always seeking to destroy and operating in this negative, pessimistic like sort of mode of critique, which I think a lot of people on the left do. So I guess like I actually think what this book does, in addition to everything that you all are saying, and what I hope our own discussion has sort of kind of exemplified, is that part of what it sounds like to sort of read or sort of study together and talk together in a way that isn't so collapsed into these sort of like patriarchal sort of norms, is to actually say that you can kind of do both of these at the same time. And I think it's necessary, because one of the things that I'm like always very hesitant and cautious about is I think some of the responses, especially for people who, have encountered left spaces, however they define anarchist, Marxist, whatever, Posadist, I don't really care, in terms of this sort of reaction to it, is to then say, well, the solution is to only read things or to only grapple with things and only see its virtues or to only see what it's useful for. And I think it can really shy away from how, critique is absolutely necessary. But how you're utilizing that critique, I think, can look very different and can be used to very different ends. So this is maybe a bit of like a meta kind of statement about just how we've been discussing the book, because at the end of the day, I'm like honestly, I think probably most men that I encounter on the left probably should be reading this as like a core thing that they start with, precisely because the thing I've seen happen most often is like a lot of the men that I've organized with will like acknowledge the importance of feminism and will like have some sort of idea that, oh, we need to have more like women like in our spaces. And they know that it's a problem and it says something important that more women aren't involved in their spaces. But there isn't much of a real reckoning with how their own behaviors and ways of being socialized and how they're exemplifying these patriarchal norms that are the background that these leftist spaces exist in are like contributing to that. And I think that on that note, like, it's like, yeah, everyone probably should read this. Critiques aside, it's like you can critique it and understand how it doesn't go far enough, or maybe it does privilege a certain kind of like virtue politics, and it might be a result of bell Hooks's, liberalism that needs to be combated. And yet I can still at the same time be like, yeah, and I'm pretty sure like every man I've ever organized with would probably benefit greatly from reading this book and needs to have a serious fucking reckoning with themselves and with other men that they organize with in precisely the ways that Hooks is talking about. So to me, it's like, critiques aside, it's like, oh yeah, everyone should read this. Like there's a lot of shit that I fundamentally disagree with, and I'll still basically be like, yeah, but you should read this precisely because you disagree with it.
Yep. I think that was really well said. I'll just say, like, part of the relevance I think that it has today is, in addition to everything that you just said, which I second wholeheartedly, is that it really, I think, is kind of mind-blowing almost to think about a lot of what she says. Because, like, again, I said this, I think, in part one, is like, it reminds me of capitalist realism in terms of like describing like an ideological moment that we live in, and how like people cannot see beyond the ideological moment and how we sort of act it out every day, and in ways that we don't even realize. And like, to me, like another title for this book could be Patriarchal Realism, like, and how it operates on a cultural level and how we participate in that in the cultural production of it and receive the cultural production of like a patriarchal culture. So to me, it's just like, honestly, I think it's very, very, I think it as a critique of patriarchal culture, and not just as a critique of it, but even more so just as like an exposition of it, just like an explanation of what it is, to me is very profound in this book. Like, I think it's actually very profound the way that she just lays it out there. Like, this is what patriarchy is. This is how it operates. This is the ways that we encounter it every day. And this is like the social process that creates it from boys to men. So just on that level alone, it's like very, very worthwhile to read. And I think one way, at least, to start incorporating this into our organizing is like, yeah, if you're part of an organization with men, and especially if you're part of an organization that has a problem like this, which I think if you're a man and you're a leftist, you've probably been in a space like that. Not necessarily, but there's a good chance. Like, it's not a bad idea to just honestly like have this as a starting point and like meet as men, as leftist men, and just like talk about this and talk about the ways, if you're comfortable with it, like talk about the ways that we have been harmed by patriarchy, and talk about the ways that we can, incorporate a more feminist ethos, I guess, and a feminist like practice into our concrete organizing. And maybe then we would see it might be easier to start building solidarity with women for men. In terms of, and that's something I've been wanting to try to get from this book. I still think there's ways to like think more about like how we can incorporate this into our organizing. But I'll just say, generally speaking, the relevance for today for me is like exposing patriarchal realism and how it's produced. And I think it can be, like Adam said, I think it can behoove the left basically to take it seriously and to actually talk with other men about it too.
Yeah, many of us have lived the truth that recognizing the ways we are wounded is often a simpler process than finding and sustaining a practice of healing.
Yes.
And I think that is a very central thesis of this book. And it's why I would, even with the criticisms that we have, recommend people read it, in precisely the ways that we've been talking about through this discussion of finding practices, modes of being, organizational structures that allow us to create, not just individually, but collectively, ways of healing the trauma of patriarchal masculinity for ourselves and for those with whom we necessarily need to struggle with in order to reach a point of liberation for all.
I honestly can't think of a better last word. So maybe on that note, I will just say that I want to extend much love and gratitude to both of you comrades for leading these 2 episodes and tackling this book. And I think, to me, I think the way that we're talking through it and the presentation of the material and the sort of theoretical and analytical engagement, but also the personal engagement, I think is part of what it is to try to embody some of these qualities that Hutz is pushing us, to exemplify. So to me, I can't think of a better way to present it. And I just wanted to say thanks to you, and hopefully, a lot of our comrade listeners will, if not pick it up, at least start to take the ideas really seriously, and it'll add a lot to how they're thinking and sort of acting.
And to go in peace and be in solidarity, as I love to say.
As you do love to say. And also just to remember that we out here. And to also keep your dagger sharp.
Sever the people.
To sever the people. So especially sever the masculinity in yourself and the other male comrades. All right. Well, I guess we'll catch you all next time. Yeah, do you have a last word?
Yeah,
comrade?
Just last word. I think women would also, people who are socialized feminine would also get a lot out of this because, and we didn't touch on it as much, I think. If we had more time, I think we could probably do another episode just on the relationship of women to masculinity in this book. But she says a lot of very powerful things about the ways in which women are also inculcated in the perpetuation of patriarchal masculinity. So don't think that you need to be socialized masculine in order to get something really important from this book.
Oh yeah. All right. Well, thanks. Yeah. Thanks and love to both of you as well. It's a pleasure.
All right, y'all, we're going to get out of here for the week. Another successful Red Library, icy cold motherfucking take, spicy hot banger on love, masculinity, gender, feminism, all that other good stuff. One last shout out to Comrades Ryan and Tiberius for doing all the notes, for leading this episode, doing an amazing job. And obviously you will hear from them again very, very soon. We hope these episodes do justice to the memory of Michael Brutz, a fallen leftist podcaster gone way too soon, way before his time. But his spirit will live on, and hopefully his humor, his sharp wit, and his heart and his compassionate approach to other people on the left will live on, not only for our show, but others as well. Remember, stay hydrated, stay motivated, and in honor of Bell Hooks, seek for ways to be emancipated each and every day, in every corner of your life. That's what we're trying to do here on Red Library each and every week. And remember, if you're doing that out there, you're not alone, because we out here. We'll see you back here next time. Red Library out. Peace.